What if our entire understanding of history is based on a lie? What if nearly 300 years of our recorded past never actually happened, fabricated by rulers with something to hide, something to gain, or something to control? This is the shocking premise of the phantom time hypothesis, a theory that suggests the years 614 AD to 911 AD were completely invented. If this is true, it would mean that entire historical events, legendary rulers, and even the rise of medieval Europe were falsified, rewritten to fit a manipulated timeline. This theory was first introduced by Dr. Heribert Illig, a German historian in the 1990s. Illig argued that the early Middle Ages, sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages, were not just poorly documented, but were outright fabricated. He suggested that the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and possibly even the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII conspired to alter historical records in order to make their rule align with a specific symbolic year, the year 1000 AD. Illig claimed that these rulers wanted to legitimize their power by placing themselves in what they considered a significant moment in history. In doing so, they allegedly ordered the rewriting of history, the modification of calendars, and the creation of fictional rulers, wars, and entire civilizations. If this were true, it would mean that everything we know about this period, from the reign of Charlemagne to the rise of Islam in Europe, never actually happened. But how could such a massive deception take place? Wouldn't there be undeniable evidence proving that these 300 years were real? Surprisingly, Illig and his supporters claim that there is evidence, anomalies in historical records, inconsistencies in architecture, and even problems with how our calendar was calculated. But before we examine the supposed proof, we need to understand how such a theory even came to be, and why some historians believe the timeline of history may not be as reliable as we think. If 300 years of history were completely fabricated, there should be clear evidence that something is wrong with our timeline. According to supporters of the phantom time hypothesis, this evidence does exist, hidden within historical records, archaeological findings, and even the way we measure time itself. Heribert Illig, the historian who first proposed this theory, pointed to three major anomalies that, in his view, suggest that the years 614 to 911 AD never actually happened. A strange lack of reliable historical documentation from this time, a puzzling absence of structures built during these phantom years, and the potential flaw in our timekeeping that suggests we may be living in the wrong year. Together, these inconsistencies form the backbone of the argument that nearly 3 centuries of history were fabricated. One of the strongest pieces of evidence supporting the phantom time hypothesis is the strange lack of written records from the early Middle Ages. Compared to other time periods, very few reliable documents exist from the years between 614 and 911 AD. Historians often refer to this time as the Dark Ages, a period of history that is poorly documented and filled with uncertainties. Many important civilizations of the time, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphates, and the kingdoms of Europe, left surprisingly little behind in terms of official records. Illig and his supporters argue that this is not a coincidence, but evidence that these years were never real in the first place. They claim that later historians were forced to fill in the blanks by inventing events, rulers, and battles to make history appear continuous. If nearly 300 years of history were fabricated, then there should also be a missing period in architecture. And according to Illig, that is exactly what we see. For example, in Western Europe, there is a noticeable lack of new buildings constructed during the phantom years. The few structures that do exist from this time, such as certain cathedrals, castles, and churches, are often dated based on historical records, not physical evidence. Illig argues that if historians were forced to re-examine these buildings, many of them might actually be younger than previously believed, further proving that this era never existed. Perhaps the most fascinating argument of the phantom time hypothesis is the idea that our current calendar may be incorrect. Illig and other supporters claim that there are serious inconsistencies in how time was measured throughout history. They argue that when the Gregorian calendar was introduced in 1582, it was meant to correct a misalignment of 10 days that had accumulated over centuries due to miscalculations in the previous Julian calendar. However, according to their calculations, the misalignment should have been closer to 13 days, not 10, suggesting that 3 centuries had been artificially inserted into history. This might sound absurd, but if true, it would mean that we are not actually living in the year 2025, but closer to 1725. The idea that entire centuries could have been invented is difficult to accept. However, the strange inconsistencies in historical records, architecture, and even our own calendar raise unsettling questions. If the phantom time hypothesis is wrong, then why do these gaps exist? And if it's right, then who manipulated history and why? Charlemagne, also known as Charles the Great, is one of the most influential rulers in European history. He's credited with uniting much of Western Europe, establishing the Holy Roman Empire, and laying the foundation for modern European nations. His reign from 768 to 814 AD is often seen as the beginning of medieval civilization after the supposed decline of the Roman Empire. But what if Charlemagne never existed at all? Heribert Illig and supporters of the hypothesis argue that Charlemagne was not a real person, but a fictional ruler fabricated to justify the 300 missing years. If true, this would mean that one of the most important figures in European history was nothing more than an elaborate political invention. But why would anyone fake an emperor? And what evidence suggests that Charlemagne never walked the earth? One of the key arguments against Charlemagne's existence is the lack of reliable contemporary sources. Unlike other major historical figures such as Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, or even Attila the Hun, there are few first-hand accounts of Charlemagne's rule. Most of what we know about him comes from texts that were written long after he was supposedly dead, often by historians who worked for rulers that benefited from his legacy. Illig argues that Charlemagne was a historical patch, inserted into history by later rulers, especially Otto III and Pope Sylvester II, to legitimize their own power by connecting themselves to a grand imperial tradition. Another suspicious aspect of Charlemagne's story is how perfectly he fits into medieval European mythology. He was a warrior king, an intellectual, and a religious reformer, all at once. He expanded his empire dramatically, supposedly winning 50 military campaigns without a single significant loss. He was a patron of learning, yet there is little physical evidence of the great educational reforms he was said to have created. To some researchers, Charlemagne seems less like a real ruler and more like an idealized figure, a hero created to serve a political purpose. If Charlemagne was as powerful as history claims, we should see clear physical evidence of his empire, including large numbers of coins, buildings, and artifacts from his time. But when Illig and others examined the period between the fall of Rome and the rise of medieval Europe, they found very little physical evidence that could be linked directly to Charlemagne's reign. The buildings attributed to him appear much younger than they should be. Coins supposedly minted in his time are strangely scarce. Many of the medieval structures that claim ties to Charlemagne were built centuries later. If an empire as vast and powerful as Charlemagne's existed, why is there so little archaeological evidence to prove it? If Charlemagne was invented, then his existence served a purpose. Illig and other researchers believe that Charlemagne was created as part of a larger effort to rewrite history, aligning historical records with a timeline that had been manipulated by medieval rulers. By creating a legendary emperor, later rulers could claim to be his rightful successors, reinforcing their own power. By fabricating Charlemagne, they also helped to fill in the missing centuries, making it seem as though history flowed naturally from the fall of Rome to the rise of medieval Europe, when in reality, those centuries may have never existed at all. Mainstream historians completely reject the idea that Charlemagne was fictional. They argue that while written records from his era are scarce, they do exist, and there are enough artifacts and structures linked to his rule to confirm that he was real. But supporters of the phantom time hypothesis believe that the evidence is not strong enough, and that too many historical inconsistencies remain unexplained. If Charlemagne was a fabrication, it would mean that a massive chunk of history, one that shaped the entire course of Western civilization, was deliberately altered. And if history was changed once, what else might have been rewritten? If nearly 300 years of history never happened, then one of the clearest ways to prove or disprove the phantom time hypothesis would be through architecture, Physical structures should reflect a continuous timeline of construction, showing evidence of civilizations building upon the past. Yet, according to supporters of the theory, something is strangely absent in the period between 614 and 911 AD. Unlike other historical eras, there is an unusual lack of significant architectural developments, as if Europe simply stopped building for nearly 3 centuries. This gap in construction raises troubling questions. If these centuries were real, where are the churches, castles, roads, and bridges that should have been built during this time? Why do we see a sudden boom in medieval architecture immediately after this period, rather than a gradual progression of styles? Historians explain this lack of construction as a result of economic decline and instability, but supporters of the phantom time hypothesis argue that this period of stagnation is only an illusion, because those years never actually happened. One of the strangest aspects of this architectural gap is the lack of major road expansions or fortresses from this time. Throughout history, civilizations have built continuously, expanding infrastructure, fortifying cities, and maintaining road networks to sustain trade and military movement. Yet when examining the so-called phantom years, there is a noticeable lack of new roads or major fortifications being constructed across Europe. If this period existed, where are the large-scale projects that should accompany the rise of early medieval Europe? Church construction presents another unusual pattern. Many medieval churches are claimed to have been built during the late 600s, 700s, and 800s, which seems to contradict the phantom time hypothesis. However, Heribert Illig argues that many of these churches have no original structures that can be definitively dated to this time. Instead, much of the evidence for their existence comes from later reconstructions, with historians assuming that the foundations must date back to an earlier period. Buildings such as Aachen Cathedral, often linked to Charlemagne's reign, have undergone so many renovations and reconstructions that their original construction dates remain uncertain. Yet historical records do not confirm their existence until centuries later. If the historical timeline were reassessed with fresh scrutiny, many of these ancient structures might actually turn out to be younger than previously thought, further supporting the idea that the missing centuries were artificially inserted. Another architectural mystery is the sudden explosion of medieval construction beginning around the year 950. After centuries of supposed stagnation, Europe experienced a dramatic surge in the building of castles, cathedrals, and urban infrastructure. It is almost as if medieval civilization emerged fully formed, rather than developing gradually over time. If history had been progressing naturally, we would expect to see a slow transition from Roman architecture to medieval styles, not a sudden burst of construction that seemingly appears out of nowhere. The rapid rise of medieval Europe after the 10th century suggests that something is missing from the historical record. Could this be because the missing centuries never happened at all? Mainstream historians reject the idea that a lack of architectural evidence proves the phantom time hypothesis. They argue that many structures from this period may have been destroyed due to war, natural disasters, or simple decay, particularly since wooden buildings deteriorate much faster than stone. They also suggest that economic and political instability may have slowed construction, leading to fewer preserved structures. However, supporters of the theory counter that while some buildings may have been lost, we should still see more evidence of expansion, repairs, and modifications to existing structures. The architectural gap, they argue, remains a troubling inconsistency. If these missing years were truly fabricated, then the question remains, who would have had the power to rewrite history? If nearly 300 years were added to the timeline, who stood to gain from this deception? The answer, according to the phantom time hypothesis, lies with emperors and religious leaders who may have altered history itself for their own benefit. If the phantom time hypothesis is true, the most critical question is why someone would go to such extraordinary lengths to fabricate nearly 3 centuries of history. Rewriting the past on such a scale would require immense power, coordination, and a clear motive. According to Heribert Illig and other supporters of the theory, this deception was not accidental. It was an intentional act carried out by rulers and religious authorities for political and ideological gain. The most commonly cited figures behind this alleged falsification are Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. Their supposed goal was to rewrite history in a way that legitimized their rule, manipulated religious prophecy, and created the illusion of an unbroken timeline leading up to the year 1000 AD, a symbolic and politically significant milestone. One of the central claims of the phantom time hypothesis is that Otto III, who ruled the Holy Roman Empire from 996 to 1002 AD, had a vested interest in placing himself in the millennial year 1000 AD. In medieval Christian thought, the year 1000 carried great apocalyptic and prophetic significance. Many believed it marked the end of an era or even the second coming of Christ. By placing his reign within this symbolic time frame, Otto III could strengthen his claim to divine legitimacy and reinforce his authority as a ruler chosen by God. But there was a problem. If historians at the time miscalculated the years following the fall of the Roman Empire, then the true year might have been far earlier than 1000 AD. To correct this, Otto III and his allies may have added phantom centuries to the calendar, artificially aligning history with their own rule. According to this theory, Otto III, along with Pope Sylvester II, manipulated historical records, altering documents and forging evidence to create an illusion of continuity. This fabricated timeline not only placed Otto III in a powerful symbolic position, but also connected him to a glorious imperial past, supposedly tracing his rule back to the legendary Charlemagne, who, if this theory is correct, may never have existed at all. If a historical forgery of this magnitude took place, the Catholic Church would have played a key role. During the medieval period, the Church controlled much of Europe's written records, including official chronicles, monastic accounts, and religious texts that shaped the perception of history. Pope Sylvester II, a close ally of Otto III, was one of the most influential figures of his time. Supporters of the phantom time hypothesis suggest that he had both the means and the motivation to rewrite history in a way that served the Church's interests. By extending the timeline, the Church could solidify its role as the central power in medieval Europe, reinforcing the idea that Christianity had reigned unchallenged for centuries. Additionally, by supporting Otto III's bid to rule in the prophesied year 1000 AD, the Church could further entrench its influence over the Holy Roman Empire. Another key figure linked to this supposed conspiracy is Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, who ruled in the 10th century. Some versions of the phantom time hypothesis suggest that he may have participated in, or at least benefited from, historical manipulation. Constantine VII was known for his extensive efforts to rewrite and reorganize Byzantine history, commissioning historical texts that selectively emphasize certain rulers and events while omitting others. This selective editing of history aligns suspiciously well with the idea that an entire period of history was being restructured. If the Western Holy Roman Empire was fabricating centuries, the Eastern Byzantine Empire may have engaged in similar historical alterations, either to align with the West or to reinforce its own imperial narrative. The idea of altering nearly 300 years of history might seem impossible, but supporters of the phantom time hypothesis argue that, in medieval times, it would have been surprisingly feasible. Unlike today, when historical events are meticulously documented in multiple independent sources, medieval history relied heavily on a small number of written chronicles, religious texts, and royal records, most of which were controlled by monarchs and the Church. If key rulers and religious institutions coordinated their efforts, they could have altered official records, destroyed conflicting evidence, and promoted a new version of history that became accepted as fact. Furthermore, the vast majority of people in medieval Europe were illiterate. The only ones capable of recording and preserving history were monks, scholars, and scribes working under the authority of rulers and the Church. This made it easier for those in power to reshape historical narratives without much resistance. Over generations, these fabrications would have been copied, rewritten, and eventually accepted as historical truth, while any remaining evidence of the real timeline was lost to time. Mainstream historians reject the idea that 300 years of history were fabricated intentionally. Instead, they argue that any inconsistencies in historical records or the calendar are likely due to human error, miscalculations, or the loss of documents over time. They maintain that while there are gaps and uncertainties in medieval history, these do not indicate a deliberate effort to create phantom years. Some scholars also point out that historical records from outside of Europe, such as Chinese, Islamic, and Indian sources, do not show any missing centuries. If the phantom time hypothesis were true, then these records should also reflect the same historical void, but they do not. Still, supporters of the theory argue that history is written by those in power, and if the Western world dictated much of the historical timeline, then non-European sources may have been disregarded or reinterpreted to fit the accepted chronology. The idea that nearly 300 years of history were fabricated is one of the most radical historical theories ever proposed. If true, it would mean that much of what we accept as medieval history never actually happened. That Charlemagne was a fictional ruler, that the transition from the ancient world to the Middle Ages was manipulated, and that we are living in the wrong year entirely. But is the phantom time hypothesis supported by real evidence? Or is it an intriguing but ultimately flawed conspiracy theory? To answer this, we must examine both the strengths and weaknesses of the theory and consider whether it holds up against historical scrutiny. Supporters of the phantom time hypothesis argue that several major anomalies suggest that the years 614, 911 AD never actually existed. The first and most significant issue is the mysterious gap in historical records. The so-called Dark Ages are poorly documented, with very few contemporary written sources. Compared to other historical periods, this era lacks the volume of recorded history that one would expect from nearly 3 centuries of human civilization. Illig and his followers argue that this is because these years were never real, they were simply added to historical timelines later. The second major point is the lack of major architectural developments during this period. Europe appears to have gone from the fall of Rome to the rise of medieval civilization, without leaving behind much physical evidence of construction, engineering, or infrastructure development. If these centuries were real, where are the roads, bridges, castles, and churches that should have been built? And why does medieval architecture suddenly explode in development around the year 1000 AD rather than progressing gradually over time? Another key argument is the flaw in calendar calculations. When Pope Gregory III introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1582, it was meant to correct the drift that had accumulated over centuries due to inaccuracies in the Julian calendar. However, the correction accounted for only 10 days, when mathematically it should have required 13 days, suggesting that 3 centuries were added to history somewhere along the way. The fourth argument focuses on Charlemagne's questionable existence. If Charlemagne was truly one of the most influential rulers of medieval Europe, why are the records of his reign so fragmented and contradictory? Why is there so little contemporary evidence of his rule? And why do his supposed accomplishments seem almost too perfect? As if he were a mythologized figure rather than a real person. Finally, supporters point to historical inconsistencies across different cultures. The idea that entire centuries could be fabricated may seem absurd, but history is written by those in power. If European rulers manipulated their own timeline, could it be possible that other cultures later adopted this altered history without realizing it? Mainstream historians overwhelmingly reject the phantom time hypothesis, arguing that the evidence presented by Illig and his supporters is based on misinterpretations, selective readings, and oversimplifications. One of the biggest flaws in the theory is that it relies too heavily on gaps in European historical records, while ignoring the fact that other civilizations documented the passage of time independently. Chinese, Persian, Islamic, and Byzantine sources all contain continuous records of events that align with the supposed phantom years. If these years never happened, why do historical documents from these cultures provide evidence of rulers, wars, and scientific progress during that time? Another counter-argument is that just because a period lacks documentation does not mean it did not exist. The so-called Dark Ages were marked by political turmoil, economic instability, and widespread illiteracy, all of which contributed to fewer written records. However, what records do exist, including manuscripts, coins, and archaeological findings, suggest that these centuries were real, even if we do not have as much surviving evidence as we would like. The argument about the lack of architecture is also problematic. While it is true that fewer grand structures were built during this period, this can be explained by the social and economic challenges of early medieval Europe. Many structures from this time were built with wood rather than stone, making them less likely to survive to the present day. Furthermore, many churches, castles, and settlements that existed in the 7th and 9th centuries were later renovated or built over, making it harder to find untouched structures from that era. The calendar miscalculation argument is also widely disputed. While it is true that the switch from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar involved correcting for lost time, historians argue that Illig's interpretation is incorrect. The 10-day adjustment made by Pope Gregory XIII was based on the assumption that the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD had accurately aligned the calendar with the solar year. However, it is likely that even the calculations made in 325 AD contained minor errors, meaning the discrepancy does not necessarily prove that centuries were added. The final and most damaging argument against the phantom time hypothesis is that forging 300 years of history would require an impossibly large conspiracy. Altering official records, fabricating rulers and events, and ensuring that every civilization in the world accepted the same fictional timeline would be extraordinarily difficult, especially in an era when communication across continents was slow and unreliable. Even if Otto III and Pope Sylvester II had wanted to alter history for political reasons, they would not have been able to control the historical records of China, Persia, or the Islamic world, all of which provide a consistent historical timeline that contradicts the idea of missing centuries. History is the foundation of civilization, our collective memory, the record of who we are and where we came from. But what if even that is not as reliable as we think? The phantom time hypothesis may not be widely accepted, but it forces us to confront an unsettling truth. History is not an objective record of events, but a story told by those who had the power to write it. Even if 300 years were not deliberately fabricated, history has always been shaped by rulers, religious institutions, and political forces that benefited from controlling the past. If parts of history can be manipulated, misinterpreted, or even erased, what else do we accept as truth that might be wrong? Because if history is a story, then who wrote it? And more importantly, who decided what was left out?